A crowd of 25,000 rabid soccer fans at New York's Polo Grounds see Kilmarnock of Scotland kicking off in the game against undefeated Bangu of Brazil for the American Cup playoff in the International Soccer League. Bangu in striped shirts proves early why Brazil won the World Soccer title 2 years ago. After 3 minutes of clever footwork in Kilmarnock territory, Santos scores for Bangu. Bangu is favored, but the team from Scotland is no pushover with a long pressing attack that might bring them a sudden goal to tie it up. But the Brazilian goalie is on his toes. In the second half, the squad from South America keeps the pressure on Kilmarnock. With 3 minutes left, a 25-yard boot by Santos has the Scottish goalie playing heads down ball. Watch this. A good try, but not good enough. Bangu wins 2-0, and the boys from Brazil have a big cup as a going-away gift.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey there, everybody. How's it going? Can you feel the excitement crackling in the air? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon, and it is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast. And of course, as always, each and every week, mostly every week, is devoted to the exploration of what used to be in the realm of professional sports. Thanks for coming on by. We appreciate it as always. We are bouncing back to soccer this week. And an interesting take from our guest this week, Mark Poole. I try to search up lots of books and things that are coming on the horizon and stuff. And Mr. Poole has a new book out. It's been out for about a month or so that through our various nooks and crannies of web crawling and research and all that kind of stuff, is called 99 Iconic Moments in Scottish Football. Yeah, Scottish football. I have soccer, of course, here in the United States. From the famous to the obscure, that gets my attention. Scotland's glorious, unusual, and cult games, players, and events. Now, if you are a huge soccer fan or have grown up or a fan of or fancy the Scottish brand of football, you're in the Celtic, Rangers, or whatever, other the Scottish Premier League teams are these days, and the discussions that go on about possibly, have them at least joining maybe a European Super League and all that kind of stuff. This obviously is a must-have book, and it's great. It's all kinds of idiosyncratic, shall we say, stories about various teams, both the national versions and club versions in Scottish football. But our ears and eyes get alert when we stumble across things that hit the United States or North American radar. And in the sport of soccer, really interesting confluences in two events, one of which you heard the clip for. From 1960, that clip was, and something called the International Soccer League, which at previous episodes you may have heard us talk about. The International Soccer League was essentially a U.S.-based soccer situation in the summers, ran for about 5 or 6 years, seasons in the United States, largely in the New York metropolitan area, but up and down the East Coast as the years rolled on. The Polo Grounds, a very famous place for this stuff. Ebbets Field, a number of games, and such. And what was it? It was a concoction by this guy named Bill Cox, a wealthy, U.S. sports-oriented businessman and controversial owner of the Philadelphia Phillies, and him not being able to. We get into that in previous episodes, so you can look that up. But let's put it this way: Mr. Cox was inveterate as an entrepreneur, despite baseball banning him from being an owner in baseball. Let's just leave it at that. But recognizing that soccer could be a thing in the United States in the early 1960s, imported full clubs to play a round-robin sort of centric tournament with stakes, a cup, and all that kind of stuff. And for 6 seasons, from 1960 through 65, you had teams from all over the globe, from Greece and Brazil and Bayern Munich and Germany and Prague and of course Scotland was represented. And we get into the story of the 1960 international version of the International Soccer League, the very first season, with our conversation with Mark Poole. That's our entree, because there was so a number of Scottish teams played in this ISL, but the one that's probably most remembered and recognized was Kilmarnock, which played 4 of those seasons, and in 1960 won its division. And we'll get into the sort of the mechanics of that. It's kind of crazy. There were sort of 2 groups, and the first group played in the beginning part of the summer of 1960, then halted, and most of the teams went back to their respective countries. And the second stage or group played, and then there was a final between those 2. So the Kilmarnock team had to actually come back from Scotland and play the championship final, despite having been away for a month and resting, shall we say. Interesting, intricate stories about that. But that's one of the stories that Mark has in his book, and we wanted to kind of double click on the Kilmarnock team playing in that championship final in the 1960 International Soccer League. Let's put it this way. They didn't win, but the stories are interesting nonetheless. The other sort of iconic event that overlaps our interest is certainly something we've also talked about previously, but we want to go a little bit deeper on, and that's the United Soccer Association, which came in 1967. As you'll hear in our conversation with Mark coming up in a few minutes, there was clearly a dividing line in 1966 in American soccer, because that's when the World Cup was played, obviously in England winning its championship, of course. But prior to that time, this was the first time, 1966, where an actual World Cup match was broadcast live here in the United States. It might have been delayed a little bit, but I think NBC carried it in 1966. And despite the efforts, or maybe because of some of those efforts of the ISL in those years prior, stirring up some interest, certainly ethnically, and maybe to the quote-unquote casual American soccer or American sports fan, there was absolutely a newfound interest in maybe looking at creating a full-time professional soccer league in the United States, coming off the back or the wind from the sails of the 1966 national broadcast here in the United States, which was very well viewed. As we've talked about in numerous other episodes, right, there were not just one, but 3 groups of business folk who wanted to create a league immediately on the back of the 1966 thing, starting in 1967. Actually, it was 1968, and there was a lot of hurriedness, and those 3 became 2, and we've gotten to that conversation previously. But the United Soccer Association was one of those 2, and as we'll talk about with Mark in a few minutes, hastened in its launch, because I think it was set for 1968, but this National Professional Soccer League 1967 launched with a CBS television contract and not blessed by FIFA, although the United Soccer Association was. Let's put it this way. There was a bit of a scramble, shall we say, to kind of be the first ones. And because of that, the United Soccer Association, because the NPSL was threatening to kind of start in 67, basically said, crap, we got to get our act together. Let's import teams whole cloth, and we'll relabel them and domicile them in these various cities in the United States. And that'll be our sort of entree, and we'll sort of buy us some time for a full-fledged launch in 1968. And that's exactly where we talk with Mark about a team that went to the final of that season called the Washington Whips, owned by a guy named Earl Foreman, who many of our previous listeners will know was the founder and or co-founder and chief instigator of the Major Indoor Soccer League, but also a big wig in lots of startup sports and certainly the ABA he was very much involved in, et cetera. Aberdeen in Scotland was the team that came and represented Washington, D.C. as this thing called the Washington Whips, joined, by the way, by 2 other Scottish clubs, Dundee United, masquerading as the Dallas Tornado. Interesting stories there, Lamar Hunt and friends playing in the Cotton Bowl. And another Scottish team, Hibernian, well known and still around, masquerading as Toronto City back in the day. But Aberdeen was clearly the best of those three Scottish teams. And as we'll talk about, went all the way to the final in 1967 against another masquerading team, if you will, the Los Angeles Wolves, who, of course, were Wolverhampton Wanderers. And an epic game that occurred then in 1967 in the late summer, and a story of lore, some of which we've talked about in previous episodes. But we're going to click on that again with our conversation with Mark Poole as we talk about the exploits in 1967 of this Aberdeen club masquerading, again, as the Washington Whips. And, of course, perhaps the Scottish team that kind of started the dynamic here in the United States, Kilmarnock, in their International Soccer League of 1960. Obscure, yes. Important, yeah, believe it or not. And part of the fabric of pro soccer's beginnings, if you will, or new beginnings here in the United States. We're going to dispense with all that preamble. We're going to dispense with any promotional stuff. But go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find convenient links to this book of Mark's, and we'll have some other cool stuff to link to as well. But let's get to that conversation, shall we? Let's talk about two of these 99 iconic moments in Scottish football. Let's talk about the Scottish football experience, shall we say, in the 1960s with the International Soccer League and the United Soccer Association. Here's our conversation with Mark. We had, what it was, about 2 weeks ago? Yeah, here it is. Thanks for listening, and please, as always, enjoy. I'm really intrigued to chat with you. We kind of scour the earth, shall we say, for all kinds of entrees into this little weird niche that we've kind of created for ourselves, which is, teams and leagues and situations and tournaments and events and all that kind of stuff in the realm of pro sports, largely North American centric, because that's where we live. Obviously, in a lot of, professional sports seems to have flourished in North America, over the years, all kinds of wacky and strange and sometimes or oftentimes forgotten kinds of things. But, I love the stuff from Pitch Publishing, and we look at all kinds of sort of international approaches to things. And sure enough, delving into your current book, which we'll describe in a moment, of course, laser focused on a couple of different sort of situations in the United States where Scottish football had a role or two. And I'm fascinated at these little diversions, I guess, and I suspect you are too. But before we go further, why don't you kind of describe for our audience who you are and what your entree is into the, shall we say, the long and torturous history of Scottish football, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, I was born in Glasgow in 1975, grew up in Edinburgh, and it's pretty inevitable that when you grow up in Scotland, you become, almost everyone develops a deep love of football or soccer, and I was no exception. And I am currently channeling that passion into writing, and particularly stories that interest me. And that's what led me to write the book, 99 Iconic Moments in Scottish Football. It's basically 99 separate articles about incidents, matches, and events that I think are really interesting.
Well, so why don't you sort of lay out on the table, I guess, especially for our audience that didn't have the luxury or the benefit of growing up in Scotland. Maybe can you describe for the outsider what it is to be a Scottish football fan, and maybe a little bit of insight not only on the international front, but also the domestic, professional game vis-a-vis Europe and all the things that have happened over the last number of decades. Because frankly, from an outsider's perspective, and I know enough to be dangerous, right?
Right.
It feels to me that it's not easy being a Scottish football fan on either level.
Right, I know what you mean. Yeah. So Scotland, obviously, is a relatively small country, and we've got a big noisy neighbour to the south. So 5 million people live in Scotland. 55 million people, roughly, I think, live in England. Um, and then there's lots of other big successful footballing countries in Europe as well, Spain, France, Germany, Italy. And but Scotland's passion for football is up there with all those countries. Uh, we were at the forefront of developing the game alongside England. Basically, we're the two countries that were most responsible for developing football in the late 19th century, going into the early 20th century, and sort of spreading that around the world. Arguably, Scotland invented passing football. Players passing to each other rather than just charging at each other with the ball, which is what it previously been like in England in the sort of 1870s. So we feel like Scotland has a key role in football development across the world. We're one of the most passionate nations in the world, I would say, about our football. We're a smaller country than other successful football countries, and we've tried to punch above our weight for decades, and with a fair amount of success, but not always, not always successfully. We've featured in a lot of World Cups, but not got very far at those World Cups. And we've had some of the best players in the world. We've had players that have been awarded the trophy for being the best player in the world, like Denis Law, for example. And Celtic have won the European Cup, one of the two huge clubs in Scotland. Celtic and Rangers are two of the biggest football clubs in the world, and far bigger than anyone else in Scotland. And so Celtic were I think the fifth ever club to win the European Cup after Real Madrid, Milan, Inter, and Benfica, which was quite an achievement. So before any English teams, which is something that's quite important to us in Scotland. And yeah, generally, we do punch above our weight at football, but yeah, it can be a struggle sometimes because we are quite a bit smaller, and now with money being more important in football and being more present in the bigger leagues, our clubs in particular are struggling a bit to keep up with the bigger leagues. But currently, our national team are doing really well. We've just qualified for the next European Championships, and we won 5 games the first 5 games of our qualifying group, including beating Spain 2-0. So yeah, we're feeling pretty good about ourselves on the international stage at the moment, but that'll probably be temporary.
Oh, now, okay, so there you go. There's always that sort of Scottish doubt sort of there at the end. Yeah. So, all right, so let's unpack that a little bit, especially on the pro circuit there, right? So I think most passing knowledgeable fans are at least aware of those two iconic teams that you mentioned, Celtic and Rangers. And maybe you, for our audience, maybe you can sort of backtrack a little bit to kind of, I know it's kind of a challenge in just a few minutes, but kind of a little bit of a history sort of between those two teams, because they are outsized, if you will, in terms of all of that. And then there's the rest of the league. But maybe you can also put those two teams in context to what is now the Scottish Premiership, because I think part and parcel of all of this is Scotland's role, both politically and culturally, and on the sporting landscape, when it comes to football/soccer generally. And, it's got to be an interesting diversion and maybe not necessarily tremendously helpful to the Scottish psyche, regardless of which team, of the outsized and just unbelievable influence of the English Premier League over the last number of decades. So I guess the question from an outsider's perspective is, this great culture, 2 of these iconic teams, yet not able to sort of somehow participate in the vast riches, I guess, of the EPL. Can you kind of sort of explain all of that scenario as to maybe why maybe the Scottish clubs were not part of that process, et cetera? And maybe that has some implications for for Ireland and Wales and Northern Ireland too.
Yeah, so I guess there has been sort of very early stages of speculation and talk about potentially Celtic and Rangers moving out of the Scottish League and into the English League at some point. That's the sort of topic that comes up every so often because, yeah, like you say, it would enable them to financially realise their potential to a fuller extent than they currently manage. And then with the knock-on, with then the effect of that would be obviously with more finances, they'd be able to compete more on a bigger stage. It's something that's never really happened for a number of reasons. One thing that isn't discussed as much is the Scottish and English leagues merging completely, which would also give Celtic and Rangers that opportunity, but would also give the next tier of clubs in Scotland, for example, Hearts and Hibs from Edinburgh and Aberdeen, who've had a fair amount of success throughout their history, in spite of the dominance of Celtic and Rangers. It would give them an opportunity to find their level in a bigger pool as well. But Scotland is fiercely independent from a football point of view. It's one of the, without wishing to go down a political road about Scotland and independence, it's an area where Scotland is a country, an independent country on the world stage in terms of football. And we're very protective of that because it's quite a positive thing in terms of identity and nationhood. So I think there's a bit of a fear that if we tinker with that too much, that we'll lose some of that, and potentially that FIFA might turn around and say, well, if Scotland isn't really an independent country anymore in terms of football, in terms of the leagues, why do you have a national team who get invited to try and qualify for the World Cup? And we really don't want to lose that. Whether FIFA would say that or not, I don't know. But it's a risk it's sort of genie we don't want to get out of the bottle, that. So yes, there is every so often speculation about Celtic and Rangers trying to move to England. Also, there's probably clubs in the Premiership in England who would not welcome Celtic and Rangers because of the additional competition, because clubs towards the bottom end of the English Premiership don't want more competition to be there because the riches that are available to them from being in that league are something they would like to hold on to.
Well, look, I think you're at the nub of it, right? I mean, the cultural and the economic and the political, frankly, all of these things intersect, right? When you talk about this particular issue, right? So, note that we're not there. There have absolutely been a number of Welsh teams, though, that have nibbled their way into the Premier League over time, right? So that's a far different sort of kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, it does act as a precedent, but it is a different dynamic. Yeah, that's more because there wasn't a strong and independent Welsh league, as there is in Scotland for big clubs like Cardiff and Swansea to play in. So that a long time they've been in the English league for a long, long time because they didn't really have a Welsh league that was big enough for those clubs.
Look, it also gets you into sort of the rumblings, the ever-present rumblings of a European Super League and, a boundaryless kind of thing. And the big rich countries, countries. I was going to say companies, and then I corrected myself, and I'm still wrong. Yeah. The rich clubs, right, with their, trying to create their own sort of walled garden, if you will, of much more closed and controlled competition, right, which, in many respects just kind of attacks the soul of the sport with the promotion and the relegation thing. It just, and I guess underlying all of it is money, right? It's always more games, more money, and more, private equity pumping up the values of these franchises. And, I can imagine that at least those two super clubs, if you will, in Scotland, and maybe the league itself, right, kind of looks at that sort of from a very dual point of view that, there's certainly some riches and some benefit to come, but then there's also probably give up a little bit or a lot of our soul if we were to do these kinds of things.
That's absolutely the balance, yeah. And that's the reason why I think Celtic and Rangers haven't pursued more forcefully trying to get into the English Premiership for starters. Anyway, it's interesting what you say about the. Of course, always comes with a caveat of would they be welcomed by the English Premiership or not? But yeah, it's interesting about the short-lived Super League idea that was floated a couple of years ago, and the fans were absolutely appalled by across even.
But it, it's going to come back, right? The idea will not go away, and it's just a matter of making it. I don't know, trying to figure out ways to make it palatable so that it can go down smoothly. I guess I'm with you, but
Yeah, I mean, I did wonder at the time how Celtic and Rangers would feel about it if they were invited, because I think it didn't get far enough to find out exactly what would happen if it did happen. But yes, I think there would potentially, it could be a scenario where Celtic and Rangers did get invited to that Super League. Certainly if it was large enough. Because, I mean, Celtic have 60,000 fans at every home game against quite small teams. Rangers went through a terrible time financially 10 years ago and then came back in the fourth tier in Scotland and still had 40,000 fans turning up to games against teams of semi-professionals who are, like part-time footballers who are also like firefighters or teachers or and generally play in front of 500 fans. And Rangers had 40, 50,000 fans turning up for games against really quite small teams in the lower leagues. And I think these are two of the biggest clubs in the world, I think. And and it's a bit of a strange balance for them being in a league in a small country.
All right, well, let's go on. Let's double click on that sort of strange idea, because the definition of professional soccer in the United States in the 1960s was the epitome of the word strange. And as listeners to this show have known, we've gone very deep on all kinds of stuff, especially in the, I guess, the road to the sort of second level of professionalism in the United States that happened around the 1960s. 1966, the World Cup. That was the first time that major event was broadcast, at least the final was, live in the United States. And but it's interesting, two of your stories in this book talk about sort of the role of some Scottish football in both the precedent to that event in 66, as well as what followed on. So let me talk about sort of that first part, right? So it's really interesting to note that in the history of the United States game of soccer, right, the arrival of immigrants from various foreign lands certainly helped stoke a long-standing love of the game, albeit very regionally and kind of focused on a lot of those sort of ethnic enclaves, right? But by the 1960s, you had sort of this budding understanding and a second generation or two of people who had been here after relocating, to the point where there were a number of entrepreneurs here that were thinking that, hey, this professional soccer thing may indeed finally be ready for us in the United States. And in comes this curious thing, but maybe not too curious by comparison. A competition called the International Soccer League. And like the name implies, right, this is essentially a setup of summer games with an exhibition slate, yet for a cup, right, sort of a competition kind of thing, played in some major stadiums here in the United States, ostensibly for ethnic fans from various regions, but perhaps also as a table setter or a palate wetter, shall we say, for Americans, quote unquote, to maybe kind of become more involved and or understand this game. But it's very interesting as you look at the history. The teams that were imported for these 5 or so seasons of this International Soccer League, Scotland was a major provider of teams for this league, and you have one particular chapter devoted to one of those teams that almost won this cup. Do you want to sort of explain this interesting story of the early 1960s.
Yeah, you summed it up, the sort of the genesis of this really well there. It was an entrepreneur called Bill Cox who invited 12 clubs from around the world, and like you were alluding to, they were from a wide spread of different nations, and one of them was Kilmarnock from Scotland. Not the biggest club in Scotland by a fair distance. I mean, they're probably one of the 10 biggest clubs in Scotland, but they're not in the top sort of 5. They would be a fair bit smaller than the 5 biggest clubs in Scotland, and but they were fairly successful at the time. They developed a bittersweet habit of finishing second in just about every single competition they played in for about 5 years, and they were invited to play in the first ever International Soccer League, and it kicked off in 1960, and they played in the opening game against Bayern Munich, who are one of the biggest clubs in the world now, from Munich in Germany, but they weren't as good then. It kicked off then. Kilmarnock won that opening game against Bayern Munich, and they like you say, they almost won that tournament. There was quite a lot that happened, and they played in a big long group stage for a month, and then went home for a month, while the second group played their games, and then came back after that to play the winners of the other group, who were Bangu from Brazil, who are about as famous in Scotland now as Kilmarnock probably are in Brazil, but unfortunately from Kilmarnock's point of view, Bangu beat them in the final. Although Kilmarnock did get a few trophies, a few nice big trophies throughout the tournament for various things. One of their opponents, Nice, although they'd had quite an angry game with a fair bit of fighting, gave Kilmarnock a trophy for being the most sporting opponents they faced, and I think the Kilmarnock goalkeeper was given a trophy for being the player of the tournament. But it was so not one of the biggest clubs in Scotland, almost won the first ever installment of the International Soccer League in the States.
Yeah, so explain that. So you mentioned they came and they played in their division, which include not only Bayern Munich but also Glenavon of Northern Ireland. This team called the New York Americans, which ostensibly was an American quote unquote all-star team. You mentioned Nice and Burnley from the what is now known as the English Premier League, but obviously the first division then. But you're describing sort of this format, which sounds kind of odd, right? In that it sounds to me like this group was created and they played, and then they kind of took a pause, and then the second group played, and then afterwards the top 2 of those would play each other. So do I have this right? Kilmarnock left. They came to the United States. They played in the New York area in their round robin, and then they came back to play this final.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That was something that surprised me when I started delving into the story a bit deeper to do my research for the book. And because these days you just assume that the round robin group stages happen alongside each other at the same time. But no, that's not what happened. Then they had a month's worth of matches, flew back across the Atlantic, which wasn't as quick and easy then as it is now. We're back in Scotland for another month, and I think the new season must have kicked off in Scotland by the time that they flew back to New York for the final. And yeah, that's right. There was a big long gap in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, you describe it as a month and a half, and it's also interesting to note too that this International Soccer League, which continued for 4 seasons afterwards, also was largely played in the New York metropolitan area. It did expand as the years went on, but the Polo Grounds was where this final was, and the Polo Grounds, for those who remember, right, the New York Giants baseball club, and had left after a couple of after some amazing seasons. They had left at the tail end of the 50s, and it was kind of just sort of sitting there. And this is actually 2 years before a new expansion baseball club came in. I guess the best way to describe the Polo Grounds was it was kind of on its last legs. It wasn't sort of the highest level, probably playing surface and stadium. Yet you had 25,000 fans playing, watching this game against Bangu of Brazil, who actually won the game. But I got to think, and now it makes some sense, right, that the Scottish league had probably gotten underway, and here they are having to fly back after a month and a half of games prior, and it's in the middle of August, right, which is hot and humid, and probably the antithesis of what the beginning games of the Scottish league might look like back home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got to be honest, I've never heard of the Polo Grounds before I started researching this story because, yeah, like you say, it was they were coming towards the end of their life, weren't they? And yeah, just across 110th Street, I think, just above Central Park. But yeah, it must have been a strange experience flying to what would have been a lot hotter in New York than it would have been in Kilmarnock at that time in August. So yeah, it must have been a strange experience. But there was especially in the 60s, there was a lot of new experiences for Scottish clubs, and sort of as football became more global.
Did they receive a trophy for winning their division, their sort of round robin tournament? Do you know? And if so, do you have any idea, perhaps maybe where that trophy might live, or do they have it, or is it maybe lost forever, or maybe it's just an unknown?
I think they received 2 trophies, and I don't think either of them were for winning the group. I think there was one for the goalkeeper, I think, for being the player of the tournament, and one that Nice gave them awarded to them for the match that they played against them. And I imagine that they'll be, I don't know, but I imagine they'll be in the trophy room at Kilmarnock's ground. They have achieved some other things after their long period of coming second in just about every tournament. They did win the league in 1965, and that was towards the end of a period where lots of clubs other than Celtic and Rangers managed to win the odd league in the sort of 20 years after the Second World War. So yeah, I think Kilmarnock will have a trophy room that will include those trophies, I'm sure.
All right, we'll have to put that out to our audience to somehow.
Yeah.
And we've got audience all over the world, believe it or not. So we'll see. Anybody can snap a picture of those and send that to us.
Yeah,
we'd appreciate it. So let me ask you also this too. From what you know, circa 1960 or so, and the early 1960s generally with Scottish football, why do you think Kilmarnock was invited? Actually, I think they played 4 out of the 5 seasons of this tournament, because I also note that there were a couple of seasons. 62 Dundee came over, and Hearts came over in 1964 as well. I'm just curious as to why maybe Kilmarnock was invited so regularly, and maybe why even Scottish football teams were sought after for this tournament, based on what you might know.
So one part of that I probably can't answer, and one part that I actually don't have an answer to. I don't know why specifically Kilmarnock, Dundee and Hearts were invited, other than the fact, as opposed to Celtic or Rangers. Actually, Celtic weren't doing very well at that time, but as opposed to Rangers, and I don't know if it's because Rangers simply weren't available and didn't want to take part in other tournaments other than the ones they were automatically in anyway. But it was a time when Kilmarnock, Dundee and Hearts were all pretty successful by their standards. And I think Scottish clubs were good at that time globally. It was before German clubs had started becoming particularly good. We were at a similar level to English clubs, I would say. And I think it simply reflects the fact that Scottish clubs were relatively strong at the time. And I think, and I also think that there was also, at most of the games involving Scottish clubs in these tournaments that we're talking about in the 60s, I think there was a lot of ethnic Scots at the grounds as part of the crowd. It's a recurring theme for various tours of Scottish clubs to the States and Canada for decades, either sort of before this as well, that there was always a lot of Scots who'd moved to America or Canada in the crowds at these games.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, especially in the in the New York City metropolitan area.
Yeah.
You may or may not be familiar with an enclave there, a town very rich in American soccer history, largely on the backs.
This is in New Jersey, right?
Yes, in Kearney, right, indeed, and a lot of actually 1990s era World Cup players and some of our greatest U.S. Soccer Hall of Famers emanated literally out of that area, that hamlet, those teams there, Kearney Thistle and all that kind of stuff. And there was very much of an enclave there that still is very strong to this day. So I have to think that half the town of Kearney came to these games in the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that fascinating, just the fact that, that such a concentrated area, it provided quite a lot of players to the national team. Am I right?
Yeah, it's also interesting too that there was every season actually there were 6 seasons of this International Soccer League, 1960 being the first one, 1965 the last one. There was always at least one Scottish club in the play of these games. So it's clear that there was a pipeline of sorts. And my guess is that the style was relatively entertaining. And it's interesting too, also that these teams, these clubs that played in this competition were some of them are names that we know now. Quite a few of them were kind of, I would say, maybe mid-tier or mid-table for their respective countries, but no doubt that it was competitive and certainly a great set of exposure for the curious American fan, I guess. All right, let me talk to you about DraftKings Sportsbook. Hey, there's so much to be thankful for this holiday season. Family, friends, food, and of course, NFL football all week long. DraftKings Sportsbook is keeping your Thanksgiving week full of action. New customers can bet just $5 on the NFL action to score 150 instantly in bonus bets. Hey, no matter the appetite, there's something for you. Money lines, parlays, props, live bets, and so much more. You name it, they've got it. And look, there are a whole bunch of different NFL games, including maybe it's that Dolphins-Jets game on Prime Video, that Friday afternoon, Black Friday game in the afternoon at the Meadowlands. And maybe the Jets will actually surprise and come out from the darkness and defeat Miami after their hot start. Who knows what the line is going to be on that by the time you hear this, but one of just many, many games that you can play on DraftKings Sportsbook. So download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use the code GOODSEATS, and all new customers can bet $5 on the NFL Thanksgiving action to score 150 instantly in bonus bets. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL, and using that code GOODSEATS. Again, that's DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In West Virginia, visit www.1800gambler.net. Please play responsibly. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling by calling 888-789-7777 or visiting ccpg.org. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Must be 21 or older in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details and state-specific responsible gambling resources. Eligibility and deposit restrictions apply. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. Terms at sportsbook.draftkings.com/football terms. And now, back to our conversation. So the sort of white-hot event in the 60s when it comes to soccer in the United States was the World Cup played in England. And obviously we know that that England won their one and only World Cup then, and the lore and the legacy continues until someday maybe they'll win again.
Right.
But in the United States, that was a clarion call, a siren, if you will, for entrepreneurs, especially of the sports ownership variety, especially baseball owners, it seemed, here in the United States, that, hey, maybe it's time to finally, convert this sort of international competition thing into a domestic league for a number of different reasons, prime among them being dollar signs, money. Let's make some. And as listeners of this show know, and you probably also might know too, there were no fewer than 3 groups of people, ultimately then became 2, and then competitive at that had their sights on building and starting a professional league. And I'm not going to get into the murkiness of it, but there were really 2 efforts. One that was FIFA endorsed, this thing called the United Soccer Association, which we'll get to in a second, and this sort of rogue thing called the National Professional Soccer League, which had the added benefit of a national television contract. We go from, let's put it this way, 0 professional leagues in the United States in 1966 to potentially 3 and ultimately 2 competing with each other in 1967. Geez, what could go wrong? But the United Soccer Association, because of a number of different issues and having their hand forced by this thing called the NPSL, I think the original idea for these 2 leagues was to kind of start in 1968, but the NPSL got the wherewithal and I guess some of the commitments to start in 67. So, not to be outdone, this United Soccer Association reacted and said, okay, well, I'll let you explain. There was a curious approach to the USA in 1967. It wasn't the original plan, now was it?
I don't think so, no. And I don't think I'm oversimplifying it, but I think basically, like you say, they needed to start playing sooner than they planned, but they didn't have any teams. So
what could go? Yeah, well, no problem there.
Yeah. So they imported teams from Europe and existing teams and gave them new names. Including 3 Scottish clubs. Aberdeen became the Washington Whips, based in DC. Dundee United, from 60 miles down the road from Aberdeen, they flew out to Dallas to become the Dallas Tornado. And Hibs, another 60 miles south in Edinburgh, they flew to Toronto and became Toronto City. And they took part alongside English clubs, Italian clubs, clubs from different parts of Europe. They again from Ireland as well, and clubs I think from South America as well, like Cerro from Uruguay, for example. They competed in this another long tournament, this time without a month back at home in the middle. They played in groups of 12 matches. There was 2 groups. Teams played 12 matches each, and then there was a final. And again, one of the Scottish clubs was the runner-up in the final, and it was an incredibly entertaining final with 10 goals, I think, and played in the LA Coliseum. It was a quite unusual tournament. Not least of all because these European and South American teams were each given a new identity to represent different cities in the States for the duration of the tournament.
Yeah, it's interesting. They were all obviously lured by some decent dollars to come over and do this, but this is largely for the European clubs in their off season, correct?
Yes. It was in the off season. Yeah. But I guess it was filling up pretty much all of the off season. So they didn't have a break for what would have been best part of 2 years, I guess, in the end, with the seasons either side, and then this tournament.
Why do you think not only Aberdeen, but why that the allure of having 3 Scottish clubs? I mean, they were over-indexing, if you will, for this experiment. I got to think that there was some some goodwill that had been built up in the ISL days with all those clubs having played in that prior.
I think that would have been part of it, yeah. But by this point, 1967, Scottish football, club football in particular, was really on a high. This first 7 months of 1967, Scottish clubs are incredibly successful. Celtic have just won the European Cup at this point, beating Inter in the final in Lisbon, Inter from Italy, who'd won it several times themselves previously. The European Cup, Celtic won that with an incredible display of attacking football in one of the best performances in the European Cup final ever. Rangers and Kilmarnock again had both been extremely successful in Europe that season. Rangers had got to a final, Kilmarnock had got to a semi-final of other European trophies. And although Scotland had narrowly failed to qualify for the 1966 World Cup, having been in a very tough qualifying group with Italy and narrowly missing out, the Scotland team at that point was one of the best collections of players we've ever had in the international team. And also, I think it was April 1967, we'd completely outplayed England, the world champions, at Wembley, and comprehensively beaten them 3-2 with a brilliant performance. And that was the first time England had lost since the World Cup as champions. And so I think it would have been a pretty straightforward decision, I think, to invite the 2, 3, and it ended up being 3 Scottish clubs to take part in the tournament.
But it also felt to me like this was no summer adventure. I mean, it seemed like, well, I guess it maybe did, but it didn't, right? I mean, by all accounts, it seems like this was a pretty first-class kind of environment for these clubs. I mean, to come over and play all these games, and they were put up in hotels and stuff, and I know there's a lot of pomp and pageantry. I know there were the various press sort of junkets and all that kind of stuff, but the quality of play, it feels to me like the competition was pretty fierce, especially when Scottish clubs under their noms de plume played each other, because that was, there's a familiarity there, even though they have got 2 different names affixed to their jerseys for those.
Yeah, I think the clubs, it was interesting writing about it, thinking to what extent were these basically Aberdeen, Dundee United, Hibs, and then English clubs like Stoke and Wolves, and to what extent were they their new identities under their new names in America. And I think basically they were their native teams under a different name briefly. And yeah, that existing rivalry would have been there. There was a lot of fierce rivalry throughout the whole tournament. There was a few pitch invasions. 3,000 fans invaded the pitch when Cagliari played Hibs. Cagliari from Sardinia in Italy, and there was another pitch invasion at Cagliari's game against Cerro from Uruguay. There was quite a lot of stuff like that, and like you say, there was a lot of pageantry as well. And I think the Scottish footballers were very excited by the standard of accommodation that they were put up in the States. They were, one Aberdeen player had a column in a newspaper in Aberdeen, and he was reporting back about having TVs and radios in their hotel rooms and how exciting that was, and kind of, I guess, reflects what life was like in Scotland in the 60s. The level of excitement at what we would now think is so basic. And there was a lot of getting invited to Andy Williams concerts and going and meeting the Washington Redskins NFL team. interesting thing that happened when Aberdeen went and met the Washington NFL team. They Aberdeen had a big Danish defender called Jens Petersen, and they got him to try kicking field goals, and he was very successful. And they tried to sign him to play in the NFL, but the Aberdeen manager was having none of that. He was quickly put a stop to that. But yeah, there was a lot of pomp, pageantry, and also some sort of less well-behaved events during the matches.
Yeah, it seems like it was kind of hit or miss in terms of the quality of play. Certainly the pitches, the refereeing, I know was questioned, to put it mildly. I guess I'm curious as to, from what you were able to discern, you're mentioning that Tommy McMillan had a column back home, but how much reporting was there on this? I mean, I'm just curious as to what the home fans maybe were really understanding about this, aside from that column, about how these teams are playing in this tournament. This is obviously largely before, the television being so as widely available as it is now. But I just had to be a curious summer being a fan back home of these teams and these games and kind of understanding what the heck it was and taking on these, essentially folding their brand, their names into these foreign cities, shall we say.
Yeah, I think the fans really got most of their news from the newspapers then. I don't think the TV or radio probably reported on it very much, although obviously I can't be sure of that. But I think they would have got their news from the papers, and I think the newspapers probably saw it as a novelty, the tournament, but quite a large and interesting novelty. So yeah, I think it was, anything that's separate from the big established tournaments like the Scottish League, the Scottish Cup, and then the established European competitions would have been like a sort of side dish. But I think there was a fair amount of reporting, based on what I saw in my research, that I think we found it a pretty interesting novelty. Yeah.
Well, I will tell you, there are some clips, not the full match though, of this final.
Fans, the history of sport is full of dramatic moments. Baseball's World Series, the football bowl game, they've produced a host of memorable performances. So have the professional basketball and hockey playoffs. Now, professional soccer still is such a new venture in North America that its moments of glory are limited. However, few sports events produce much sustained and exciting action as the United Soccer Association's first championship game. The 18,000 fans who saw it in person and the thousands who listened to it on radio or watched the telecast will remember it as one of their supreme thrills. Now, for those who may not be familiar with the background of this spectacular match, recognized professional soccer in 1967. For the first season only, the league imported 12 complete teams from Europe and South America, one team for each league city. The Washington Whips, who were represented by Aberdeen of Scotland, emerged as winners in the Eastern Division. The Los Angeles Wolves, who actually were the Wolverhampton Wolves of England, captured the Western Division title. And the Whips and the Wolves met in a championship playoff game at Los Angeles' Memorial Coliseum to climax the United Soccer Association's inaugural season. Now, in soccer, as in American football, there normally is no overtime. If the game ends in a tie, that's it. However, because this match was for the championship, Commissioner Dick Walsh ruled the two teams would play until someone won, and as a result, both teams fought their hearts out. Now, the match they played has been rated by many observers as the greatest soccer game ever seen anywhere.
So Jack Kent Cooke, right, who wound up becoming the owner of the Redskins over time, and I believe was involved in the Washington Whips franchise, or maybe it was L.A. at the time. I'm not sure, but he was largely he was like the master of ceremonies, and at the end of the game, and we'll pull up a clip for that in the lead up to this show. He's just literally regaling the audience, the crowd there, that a match arguably was probably one of the best played on American soil at that time.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to make a presentation to the owner of the Los Angeles Wolves and the man who has sponsored the Wolverhampton Wolves this year, Mr. Jack Kent Cook. Would you like to say a few words?
Thanks. And when we decided to start soccer here in America, I was warned constantly that this is a dull game. Isn't it one of the most exciting games you've ever seen in your life? There isn't a writer in Hollywood, there never has been one, who could have written a script for the game tonight. Next year, the year after, and all the years to come, we're going to be proudly privileged to bring you wonderful fans, Major League Soccer here in Los Angeles, and thank you so much.
Went to overtime and sudden death in a 6-5 game. I mean, tremendously entertaining. And it's just very interesting to sort of note that coming off of that experience and those high quality players, right? That's the antithesis of the Challenger League, the National Professional Soccer League, which was rogue, not FIFA approved, and literally was an assemblage of players that had not played with each other, right? So it looked pretty good at that time for the United Soccer Association, given that kind of excitement, that kind of crowd, and that kind of play, as sort of a high, if you will, going into play into 1968, giving them a very strong sort of kind of momentum. But alas, that wasn't going to be the model in the next year. It was going to revert back to team-based play with drafted players and all of that. But I guess I wonder how a team like Aberdeen, or frankly any of the other clubs, sort of felt coming out of that. I guess it was sort of an experience. I also wonder too where those games sort of live in terms of the stats of those franchises, right? Like how much or how little do these clubs refer to their American adventure in 1967? Is it, from what you can tell, is it part of their history? Do they remember it? Do they care about it? Is it hard to find? I'm just really curious as to what they sort of took from that American adventure in 67.
I think they view it as very unofficial. I think it's a challenging story to research. There's not really, for example, there's not information there's not information on Aberdeen, Dundee United, or Hibs websites about these tournaments. I think again they saw them as a novelty. You alluded to this earlier as well, but they got $250,000 each for turning up. So I guess that was the main motivation rather than any glory. But and it's one interesting point. It's quite it features fairly largely in the Aberdeen manager's autobiography, Eddie Turnbull, and he was a guy who had plenty of material through his career to talk about. He was a no-nonsense fella who was in the Navy in the Arctic in the Second World War, so he was a tough guy, and he had a lot of interesting experiences in his career, and but this is still one that makes it fairly well into his autobiography alongside the rest of them. Coming back to what you're saying as well, I think it's interesting, because I guess the United Soccer Association were forced into, it wasn't their first choice to import international teams, but choosing pre-existing teams did work very well for them. The players obviously knew each other. They were good sides. Aberdeen played against Wolverhampton Wanderers in the final. They were both really good sides at the time. And yeah, you're right. The final ended up 6-5 with a sudden death goal. And it was, those highlights exist of the final. It was an incredible match. So I think the United Soccer Association got really lucky there with, it obviously helped having those good established sides, but it was still, you often think a final and tournament might not, it could be quite cagey, the players take it easy, but the scoreline, players got sent off. There was a couple of hat-tricks and penalties, I think. And it was an incredibly dramatic match. And then with a lot of, again, pomp and ceremony around it, there was the Wolves players ended up getting presented with a table full of trophies, to individual players. And yeah, it was in the LA Coliseum, a great venue for it. And I suppose it's perhaps a surprise that that success didn't carry on into the following seasons.
Now, as you can see, we have individual trophies to present to the winning Wolves. And for just a moment, I'd like to bring on the manager of the ball club, the manager of the year, Ronnie Allen.
Thank you, Dick. I think everybody in the stadium has seen one of the most fantastic games of football ever being played. And I think that these fellas are as much responsible as these fellas. So I'd like to ask for 3 cheers for this lot. Okay? They played hard, they played tough, but by golly, with 10 men, they frightened us all to death. And I wish on behalf of Wolves and everybody here, I'm sure, a safe journey home for them and continued success next year. Thank you very much, Aberdeen.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that this United Soccer Association approach, right, was full of major sports owners at the time, mostly baseball, but I mean the New York Skyliners, which was Cerro of Uruguay, they were owned by Madison Square Garden Corporation, which is the owner, I believe, of the Yankees at the time. Earl Foreman was the owner of the Whips, which was the Aberdeen franchise, and Earl Foreman in the United States went on to lots of other sports entrepreneurial endeavors, including launching something called the Major Indoor Soccer League in the 80s. So he was very comfortable and a big backer of this stuff. But and we mentioned Jack Kent Cooke, who was the owner of the LA Wolves, i.e. Wolverhampton Wanderers, right? But he owned the Lakers and the Kings in Los Angeles. But it's also important to remember that Lamar Hunt, a big name in American soccer lore, he was the guy behind the Dallas Tornado and the Dundee franchise. And Lamar Hunt went on to found and sort of stick through even the lean years all the way through the North American Soccer League and then into the founding of Major League Soccer. So, this one season of interesting oddity, I guess, in 1967 had a whole lot of roots that some of which kind of stuck around and ultimately birthed what for at least a number of years in the 1970s and early 1980s was a phenomenon in the North American Soccer League, obviously to go dark in the mid 80s and until the early 1990s when the World Cup and then a new league got formed in 96 here. But we love to kind of dig into those things because those seeds, right? We talked about it with Kearney, New Jersey, and the players there and the teams that came over, right? It's these are all part of the fabric of what is now, I would argue, certainly not nearly as historically rich as what is in Scotland when it comes to the game, but the United States has a very rich history and, in many respects has a pretty strong trajectory now. And in these interesting and challenging times back in the 60s, who knew what would come from all of these things?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think, as you look back in all this, and obviously these are just two of the 99 stories that you've got sort of Scottish football. There's plenty of domestic intrigue and international exploits and stuff. Where do you sort of see the Scottish game going in the years ahead? Do you think it's inevitable that at least Celtic and Rangers get sort of scooped up into something more continental and European? Do you see the Scottish League living on even with or without them? And frankly, where do you sort of see the Scottish national team on the world stage? And does it take maybe a breakthrough either in the European Championships or even the World Cup qualifying or making the World Cup finals maybe to perhaps, elevate the Scottish League maybe into something more higher order maybe than it currently sits at?
Yeah, I don't think it's inevitable that Celtic and Rangers will leave the Scottish League, at least not for a very long time, probably. I wonder whether there might be a graduated increase in the amount of matches that are for tournaments like the European, like the Champions League in Europe, and other tournaments below that level, international tournaments, and potentially invitational tournaments like, I guess, the Super League. That when that comes back round, maybe that will happen. But that's not just a question. That's obviously not just a question that affects Scotland. That's a bigger existential question for club football in general. And but I think that would be very relevant to Celtic and Rangers, and therefore would the number of matches that you play in the domestic leagues, for example, shrink to accommodate that. There'd be a lot of resistance to that. So I think it's going to be a gradual thing, that shifting of power. I think Scottish club football, it has a challenge to we haven't been able to maintain our success on a European stage. We've continued to punch above our weight. At the moment, we're not probably punching above our weight, or probably punching at our weight, and it's going to be a continued challenge to continue to overachieve again there. I don't really see anything coming on the horizon that's going to help with that. In terms of the international team's fortunes, it very much depends on the players that we have at our disposal at any one time, and who's managing the international team. And we're in a good place with both of those at the moment. I think, to look at things optimistically, I think we're starting again to bring through more good young players, a lot of whom aren't just staying in Scotland now, a lot of whom are playing in England, and also we've got several players, young Scottish players, playing in Italy at the moment, which is great, and getting some great experience. So that's really good for the international team. We used to produce a lot of the best players in the world, well, certainly well over our fair share for our population, like going back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. That's dropped off a bit. We got a bit complacent. We got overtaken by other nations of similar size, or maybe slightly bigger nations, for example, from Eastern Europe. And now I think we are getting the basics right again in terms of player development, or starting to, at least. And I think that's a really good sign, and that's the biggest positive for the international team, because football's a simple game, isn't it? And it comes back to having good players, and that's something that Scotland used to be really good at, and I think we're getting better at it again after a bit of a slightly rough 20, 25 years, during which also, by no coincidence, we didn't qualify for any major international tournaments between the 1998 World Cup and Euro 2020. So and now we've qualified for 2 European Championships, which is great, and we are optimistic about qualifying for the World Cup in the States, Canada, and Mexico, and we are desperate. The Scotland fans, we're absolutely desperate to come and celebrate that, because we know that's going to be a phenomenal event.
Well, so FIFA's done its job. It's 48 teams now, so if you can't qualify now, I don't know when your best chance is going to be.
I know we've got no one else to blame if we can't get through with a 48-team World Cup. Isn't it? That's another reason for optimism for Scottish football. It's easier to qualify for the World Cup now than it used to be. It's remarkable to think that Scotland used to qualify when it was 16 teams, like in 1978, for example, in 1974, and. Yeah, 1974, the only team in the 1974 World Cup that didn't lose any games was Scotland. We beat Zaire, we drew with Brazil, we drew with Uruguay, but because Brazil and Uruguay drew with each other not Uruguay, Yugoslavia But because Brazil and Yugoslavia drew with each other as well and both beat Zaire, we went out on goal difference. Whereas even the winners of the World Cup, West Germany, they lost in a group stage match. So, yeah, 1974, Scotland were the only team that didn't lose any matches at the World Cup.
Time to right the wrong in this coming tournament. We wish you the best of luck. And, it would be great to see Celtic, Rangers, frankly, any of these Scottish teams come back to the United States to play what is now a very healthy and robust off-season, summer season here in the United States. So there's plenty of exhibition games to be played with Major League Soccer and United Soccer League teams here. We've got a lot of soccer-specific stadiums and stuff. And I don't know when the next opportunity is, but I would hope it would be great, frankly, to see some of these Scottish sides mix it up at least in the summertime, at least for their preseason efforts, and give our boys here a bit of a test or two.
And you can be sure there'd be lots of Scots American fans in the crowds as well, especially in sort of New York area, Chicago area, Boston.
All right, many thanks to Mark. The book, again, these are just 2 of the 99 iconic moments in Scottish football. That's the title. From the famous to the obscure, Scotland's glorious, unusual, and cult games, players, and events. It is published by our friends across the pond at Pitch Publishing. Thank you kindly for helping us get Mark and the book into the ears and the consideration of our listeners. You can find a convenient link or two at our website to this book at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I think it's number 327. My goodness. And you will find a convenient link to Amazon, where you get it as quickly, I believe, as humanly possible. It's in hardcover, at least to start, and maybe some other editions and stuff to come. While you're there, why don't you stick around and kind of tool around and look around some of the other episodes that we've done over the almost 8 years now. All kinds of teams and leagues and situations and stuff. There's probably something there. You're probably not like everything, but there's probably a few things that you might find interesting. And we strive to create more and more of that interestingness as we continue to build our little village here. Again, goodseatsstillavailable.com, your locus for everything about this show. Hopefully in 2024, we're going to get our act together and get a little bit more commercially oriented and offer some more stuff in terms of newsletters and savings of various places for shirts and all that kind of stuff beyond what we've done to date. But make sure that you bookmark that site, visit early and often. And again, you can share the episodes, you can stream them right there. But of course, the best way is to subscribe or follow us in any of your favorite podcast players/feeders. We're available wherever you can get podcasts, so just do that. That's the easiest way to make sure that you don't miss out on anything that we put out there on a weekly basis. And tell your friends, why don't you? And if you can rate or review the show, preferably 5 stars, wink, wink, nod, nod, we'd appreciate that too. That helps the various algorithms out there get to various people who might similarly enjoy, hopefully, this show as well. You can send us email, of course. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We are on various socials, not necessarily with full heart and verve, depending on who owns the social network that week and the various things that said owners might be doing or saying and stuff. But for the time being, you'll find us on X/Twitter at GoodSeatsStill. We are on Instagram at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. You will find us on Facebook at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. You will find us on Threads at GoodSeatsStillAvailable. And you will also find us, I don't know, just keep searching your various social feeds, and we're experimenting wherever decent, conversations can be had. A tricky thing these days for sure, but wherever you can find us and want to, please by all means do so. Our thanks, of course, as always this week to our longtime pal, Jerry Payne of Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. We could not do this show without him. Next week, more fun, frivolity, excitement coming your way. Hope the holidays or the season at least, is starting out well for you. And thank you for listening. As always, we'll see ya. Until next week, take care of yourselves. Bye.